General George S. Patton was not just another officer in the U.S. Army. He was the most deadly commander America had in World War II. The boldest, the most aggressive, the most uncompromising. He carried a reputation that terrified enemies and electrified his own soldiers. Every mission he touched turned into victory because Patton understood war better than anyone around him. His strategies were sharp, fast, unpredictable, and brutally effective. He was a battlefield genius, a man built entirely for combat. But beneath his victories, Patton carried a warning that almost no one in Washington wanted to hear. While the world was celebrating the fall of Nazi Germany, Patton was thinking ahead. He saw a much bigger threat rising in the East. A threat he believed would one day become America's greatest enemy. A threat called the Soviet Union. Patton was convinced that if the United States did not act immediately, if America did not strike before the Soviets reached their full strength, the nation would face a challenge far more dangerous than Hitler ever was. He believed history was giving America one final window of opportunity. And if America failed to act now, the Soviet Union would grow into a superpower that would be almost impossible to defeat in the future. This idea was not based on emotion. It came from cold strategic calculation. Patton had fought the Germans, the Italians, and the best armored divisions the Axis could produce. He knew how to read armies, how to evaluate their strength, and how to predict their future capabilities. What he saw in the Soviet Union terrified him. And so, in the final weeks of World War II, Patton proposed a plan that shook both the U.S. Army and the White House. A plan to push eastward and attack the Soviet Union before it was too late. A plan that included using surrendered German troops under American command to crush communism before communism swallowed Europe. It was bold, it was shocking, and it was immediately rejected by not just the president, but also by his own commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower. But before those rejections, Patton had already made up his mind. He believed the next war had already begun, even if no one else could see it yet. In 1945, Europe was still soaked in the smell of gunpowder and destruction. Entire cities were rubble, millions were displaced, and the Allies had just declared victory. Yet in the middle of all the celebrations, Patton felt no triumph. He felt something closer to dread. As he walked through the ruins of Bavaria and Bohemia, he saw something most diplomats ignored. On one side were the exhausted German civilians. On the other, the confident, expanding Soviet forces pushing steadily west. Patton studied every intelligence report coming across his desk. One by one, those reports showed a pattern: Soviet influence spreading deeper into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. Promises of free elections and independence made at the Yalta Conference were already being broken by Moscow. Patton had fought professional armies his entire life. He understood the difference between liberation and occupation. What the Soviets were doing was not liberation. It was strategic domination, and they were moving faster than anyone in Washington realized. He began discussing his concerns quietly with his senior staff. He told them bluntly that America had beaten the wrong enemy. Hitler needed to be destroyed, yes, but Stalin was the true long-term threat. If the Soviet Union were allowed to expand unchecked, it would become a monster that would one day threaten the entire free world. While other commanders celebrated the end of the war, Patton saw an opportunity that would never come again. At that moment, the United States held complete air superiority, unlimited fuel, unmatched industrial production, and fresh, battle-hardened troops ready for any mission. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had won the war, but at a catastrophic price. Tens of millions dead, infrastructure destroyed, supply lines stretched thin, and morale battered by endless suffering. They were strong, but fragile. Victorious, but bleeding. This was the moment, Patton believed, when the United States could decide the future of the world. Strike now, and communism could be stopped before it became unstoppable. Hesitate, and America would spend decades facing a threat far larger and more dangerous than Nazi Germany ever was. He also considered something even more controversial: the use of remaining German military units under American command. Not to restore Nazi power, but to crush the Soviet Union while they were still weak. Many officers were horrified by the idea. But to Patton, war was war. He believed strategy had to rise above emotion. The Germans hated the Soviets hated the Germans, and Patton believed he could use that hatred to America's advantage. Patton began forming a vision of what needed to happen: a rapid strike east, a preemptive blow, a campaign to push the Red Army back before it cemented control over Europe. But the moment he shared these thoughts with his commanding officer, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the pushback was immediate and absolute. When Patton finally presented his idea to the one man who could authorize even a preliminary discussion, the reaction came like a solid wall. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, listened carefully, quietly, and without interruption. But when Patton finished, Eisenhower's answer was immediate and unmovable. He rejected the proposal completely. To Eisenhower, Patton's vision was not bold, it was reckless. It was a flame that could ignite a worldwide catastrophe. Eisenhower had just overseen the largest and most complex Allied operation in history, guiding forces from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. He understood not only battlefield tactics, but global politics, fragile diplomacy, and the importance of public opinion. He knew that the world was desperate for peace, not another war. Eisenhower's priority was stability, demobilization, returning millions of American soldiers to their families, rebuilding Europe under Allied cooperation. He wanted to be remembered as the general who ended the greatest war in history, not the general who started the next one. To him, Patton's aggressive plan risked everything the Allies had just achieved. Eisenhower reminded Patton that the Soviet Union had been a critical ally in defeating Nazi Germany, absorbing unimaginable losses on the Eastern Front. The American public still viewed the Soviets as partners, even friends. Launching a surprise attack on them just weeks after victory would be seen as a betrayal so enormous it could shatter the moral foundation of the United States for generations. Patton pushed back. He argued that alliances were temporary, but national security was eternal. He insisted that Stalin could not be trusted, that every move the Soviets made was designed for future domination. Eisenhower acknowledged that Stalin was difficult, even dangerous, but he believed diplomacy still had room to work. He believed war was not the answer, at least not now. But beneath that diplomacy, there was something else. Eisenhower had a reputation to protect, a legacy to secure, a transition to a political future that he knew was possible. Opening a war against a recent ally could destroy all of that overnight, and so, with calm authority, Eisenhower shut down Patton's proposal. For Patton, this was more than a disagreement. It was the collapse of the only path he believed could save the future. If Eisenhower, the man at the top, refused to consider even a limited strategic assessment, then the idea would die before it ever reached Washington. But Patton was not finished. He believed the stakes were too high. If Eisenhower would not listen, then the president had to. And so Patton prepared to take his concerns to the White House, unaware that another, even stronger rejection was coming. This time from the most powerful man in America. Patton arrived in Washington with the same intensity he carried onto every battlefield. His boots hit the marble floors of the Pentagon with the steady rhythm of a man who had never once retreated in his life. In his mind, this was not defiance, it was duty. If Eisenhower would not act, then the President of the United States had to understand what was coming. But Harry S. Truman was not Franklin Roosevelt. He was not a wartime giant, not a man who rose through military ranks, not a leader shaped by battlefield instincts. Truman was a politician, precise, pragmatic, and determined to maintain order in a world still trembling from 6 years of chaos. When Patton was finally ushered into the Oval Office, he spoke with the same brutal clarity that made him famous. He laid out his case piece by piece, just like he planned an attack. Direct, forceful, uncompromising. He warned Truman that Stalin's promises were illusions, that the Soviet Union was already tightening its grip on Eastern Europe, that every delay would only strengthen Moscow's hand in the coming years. Truman did not simply reject the idea, he buried it. To Truman, any thought of attacking the Soviet Union in 1945 was beyond unacceptable. It was insanity. Truman was barely weeks into his presidency. He had inherited a world on fire, the final war with Japan still raging, the atomic bomb program nearing completion, and Europe lying in ruins. The United States was exhausted, grieving, and desperate to bring its soldiers home from 2 continents. The last thing Truman wanted, or could politically survive, was another war. But there was something deeper. Truman still viewed the Soviet Union as an ally. Not a perfect ally, not a comfortable ally, but a necessary one. The Red Army was still fighting Japan's forces in Manchuria and preparing for a massive offensive in Asia. Opening hostilities against the Soviets would shatter Allied cooperation overnight and possibly sabotage the final phase of the Pacific War. Truman reminded Patton that the United States had signed agreements with Moscow at Yalta just months earlier. Agreements that promised post-war cooperation, European reconstruction, and free elections in Eastern Europe. Attacking the Soviet Union immediately after signing those documents would transform America from liberator to aggressor. The diplomatic shock would be catastrophic. Britain would oppose it. France would collapse politically. The world would see the United States as the nation that restarted global war. To Truman, the very idea was a betrayal of everything the Allied cause claimed to represent. Patton countered with the same arguments he gave Eisenhower, that Stalin's promises were lies, that Soviet expansion had already begun, that Eastern Europe would fall under a new kind of dictatorship if America stayed silent. But Truman was firm. He believed cooperation still had a chance. He believed diplomacy could guide the post-war order. He believed Stalin, while untrustworthy, could still be managed with political pressure and strategic patience. So Truman ended the conversation with brutal clarity. America would not, under any circumstance, strike the Soviet Union. The military would not plan for it. The generals would not discuss it. The government would not even entertain the thought. Patton left Washington defeated in a way no battlefield had ever defeated him. The door had closed. The path he believed could save the future had been erased. And yet, history would soon reveal something haunting. Truman's trust would not last. Stalin would break the promises of Yalta. Eastern Europe would fall behind the Iron Curtain. Poland, Hungary, Romania, and East Germany would become Soviet satellites. The Cold War would ignite, exactly as Patton had predicted. By the time Truman realized the truth, it was too late. The Soviet Union had risen into a superpower. The Red Army occupied half of Europe, and the moment to stop it, the moment Patton had warned about, was gone forever. In the months following Patton's visit to Washington, the uneasy calm between the Allies began to crack. What had once been celebrated as a triumphant partnership now showed its true nature, a fragile alliance stitched together only by a common enemy. And with Hitler gone, the threads holding that alliance together began to unravel at an alarming speed. Stalin moved quickly, faster than the West expected, faster than Truman could understand. At Yalta, Stalin had promised free elections across Eastern Europe, clear, unequivocal, written commitments witnessed by Roosevelt and Churchill. But almost immediately, those promises began to rot. Soviet security forces remained in cities they had sworn to leave. Political rivals disappeared. Newspapers were censored. Opposition parties were hollowed from the inside, replaced with loyalists who pledged allegiance not to their nations, but to Moscow. And then came the first unmistakable sign of betrayal. In Poland, the country whose independence had started the war in the first place, Stalin installed a communist government under Soviet control, sidelining the legitimate Polish leadership that had fought alongside the Allies from the beginning. Britain was outraged. The United States was stunned. But Stalin did not blink. Every time Western diplomats questioned him, Stalin responded with the same cold certainty. The Soviets had sacrificed more. The Soviets had bled more. The Soviets had the right to secure their borders. It was not diplomacy. It was domination wrapped in excuses. And Patton's warnings suddenly echoed through Washington like a ghost. One by one, the nations of Eastern Europe found themselves pulled into the Soviet orbit. The process was slow enough to avoid triggering a direct confrontation, but aggressive enough to rewrite the map. It was a takeover executed with surgical precision, not with open warfare, but through political coercion. military presence, and iron-fisted control of every institution that mattered. As the truth became undeniable, Truman's confidence shattered. The man who once dismissed Patton's fears now received intelligence reports describing mass arrests, secret police operations, and communist coup silently unfolding behind the Red Army's shadow. The dream of post-war cooperation was dying before his eyes. Britain grew alarmed. France grew uneasy. And in America, the sense of betrayal deepened. Newspapers that had once praised the Soviet Union as heroic liberators now published stories of brutality, censorship, and military occupation. The public mood shifted. Congress began demanding answers. Advisors pressed Truman to respond more firmly. And behind closed doors, some officials whispered the same chilling thought. Patton was right. But the world was already changing, and changing fast. The Soviets tightened their hold on Romania, then Bulgaria, then Hungary. In East Germany, the occupation transformed into a permanent political structure, the foundation of what would soon become a divided Berlin and a divided continent. The Iron Curtain had not yet been named, but everyone could feel it descending. And all the while Patton, the one man who had predicted this future with brutal clarity, stood helpless, sidelined, isolated, and increasingly furious. His final months were spent watching the world drift toward the catastrophe he had tried to prevent. By the end of 1945, Stalin was no longer a wartime ally. He was the architect of a new empire, a rival, a challenger, the emerging enemy of the United States. And the window of opportunity to stop it, the moment Patton believed was the last, best chance, had already closed. George S. Patton was one of America's deadliest and most fearless generals, a man who always won, always advanced, and never softened his words for politics. But after the war ended, his honesty became more dangerous than any German tank he ever faced. Patton warned that the Soviet Union was the next great threat. He said Stalin had already broken his promises. He insisted the United States must act before the Red Army became too powerful. Washington didn't want to hear it. Eisenhower rejected his proposal. Truman shut the door completely. And the more Patton spoke, the more trouble he created for a government desperate for peace. So they removed him from command. The hero of the Third Army, the man who crushed Nazi Germany's last hopes, was quietly stripped of his position and sent to a small administrative job in Bavaria. It was a political exile, a way to silence the general who refused to stay quiet. But Patton didn't stop talking. He kept warning, kept criticizing, kept saying the Cold War had already begun. And just as his voice grew louder, his life ended suddenly. On December 9, 1945, a military truck collided with his car outside Mannheim. Others walked away with minor injuries. But Patton's neck was broken. He was paralyzed instantly. 12 days later, on December 22, 1945, George S. Patton died in a military hospital, not on a battlefield, but defeated by politics and fate. A general removed from command. A warning ignored. A death that ended one man's fight, but began the struggle he predicted. The Cold War arrived exactly as he said it would.